I never thought steam from my attic vent would turn into a neighborhood war. But that's exactly what happened when Brenda Patterson from the HOA decided my house was ruining the aesthetic of Meadowbrook Estates in Charlotte, North Carolina. It started on a Tuesday morning in late October when I was getting ready for work. I'm Vincent Valdez, a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant about 20 miles outside the city. I'd bought my house in this subdivision 3 years ago, right after my divorce, and it had been mostly peaceful until that autumn. The house was a nice 2-story colonial with pale yellow siding, black shutters, and a proper attic ventilation system that I'd actually upgraded myself, because I knew how important airflow was for preventing moisture damage. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when my doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass, I could see a woman with that particular haircut. You know the one, short and severely angled like she'd asked the stylist to give her something that screamed authority. I opened the door to find Brenda Patterson holding a clipboard and wearing a pantsuit that looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Vincent Valdez," she asked, even though she clearly knew who I was. "That's me. Can I help you?" "I'm Brenda Patterson, head of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. We need to discuss a serious violation occurring at your property." I blinked. I kept my lawn mowed, my trash cans hidden, and my house painted the approved colors. "What violation?" "Your attic vents are emitting excessive steam that's creating an unsightly appearance and potentially affecting neighboring properties. I've received multiple complaints." I looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "Steam from my attic vents. That's not a violation. That's basic thermodynamics. It's getting cold outside and warm air from inside the house rises into the attic. When that warm, moist air hits the cold outside air through the vents, it condenses and creates visible vapor. It happens to every house." Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not to the extent that yours does. Your house produces significantly more steam than others in the neighborhood. It's excessive and needs to be stopped immediately." "Stopped? You want me to stop physics? Don't get smart with me, Mr. Valdez." According to Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws, no homeowner shall maintain their property in a manner that creates visual pollution or aesthetic disturbances. Your steam clouds violate this provision. I rubbed my face, trying to process this absurdity. "Brenda, what you're asking is impossible. Those vents exist to let moisture out of the attic. If I seal them up, moisture will build up inside and I'll get mold, rot, and structural damage. Not to mention it could affect my roof warranty. Then you need to find another solution. You have 14 days to correct this violation, or you'll face daily fines of $100. She handed me an official-looking letter with the HOA letterhead. "Have a good day, Mr. Valdez." She turned and walked back to her Mercedes SUV, leaving me standing in my doorway holding a letter that threatened to fine me for something that was literally impossible to control without damaging my house. I read through the letter twice, each time getting more frustrated. The HOA had taken photos of my house with visible steam coming from the attic vents and compared them to other houses in the neighborhood. They'd circled my vents with red marker and written "excessive" in all caps. I called my buddy Derek, who worked in HVAC, during my lunch break that day. "You're not going to believe what my HOA is trying to pull." After I explained the situation, Derek laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Man, that's the dumbest thing I've heard all year. You've got good ventilation, that's why you're seeing more steam. It means your house is breathing properly. Those other houses probably have inadequate ventilation, which is why they're not showing as much vapor." That's what I figured, but they're threatening fines. "Don't seal those vents, Vince. Seriously. You'll regret it within a month when moisture starts building up. You could get mold in your insulation, wood rot, ice dams in winter. It'll cost you thousands to fix. I know, but what am I supposed to do? Fight it. Get a lawyer if you have to. This is ridiculous. I spent that evening researching HOA law in North Carolina and reading through my entire HOA covenant. The more I read, the more I realized that Brenda was stretching the interpretation of visual pollution to absurd lengths. The bylaws were meant to prevent things like storing broken cars in your driveway or painting your house neon green, not natural physical phenomena. 3 days later, I submitted a formal response to the HOA board explaining the science behind attic ventilation and citing building codes that required proper ventilation. I included documentation from my home inspector, information about my roof warranty requirements, and a letter from Derek explaining the importance of attic airflow. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I received another letter informing me that my appeal had been denied, and that fines would begin accruing as of the following Monday. The letter stated that failure to maintain aesthetic standards was a serious violation, and that my excuses about building codes didn't override HOA regulations. They also noted that if I didn't comply within 30 days, they could place a lien on my property. I sat at my kitchen table that night, staring at the letter and feeling my blood pressure rising. This was insane. They were essentially forcing me to damage my own house to satisfy some ridiculous aesthetic standard that didn't even make sense. I looked up at my ceiling, thinking about the attic above me with its proper ridge vents and soffit vents, doing exactly what they were designed to do. That's when a petty, angry part of my brain had an idea. If they wanted the steam gone so badly, I'd give them what they asked for. But they'd have to live with the consequences. The next Saturday, I went to the hardware store and bought sheets of plywood, weatherproof sealant, and exterior paint that matched my house trim. I spent the entire day on my roof, carefully sealing every single ridge vent with plywood and caulking. I sealed the soffit vents too, blocking off all the intake air. By the time the sun was setting, my attic was completely sealed off from outside air exchange. My neighbor Tom from across the street wandered over as I was cleaning up. "What are you doing up there, Vince? HOA wants the steam gone." "So I'm making it go away." Tom frowned. "But don't you need those vents?" "Yep. But Brenda Patterson says the steam is an aesthetic violation, so here we are." "Man, that's crazy. You know what you're doing to your house." "I do. But I've got everything documented." Sometimes you have to let people learn lessons the hard way. Tom shook his head and walked back to his house. I knew what he was thinking. I was thinking it too. This was going to be a disaster, but I was tired of fighting and I wanted to prove a point. I took photos of everything, documented exactly what I'd done and why, and sent a certified letter to the HOA board informing them that I'd complied with their demands and that I was doing so under protest and would hold them liable for any damages. The steam disappeared. My house looked just like all the others on cold mornings now, no visible vapor rising from the roof. I waited for someone from the HOA to acknowledge that I'd complied, but I never received any response. The fines stopped accruing in my account, though, so I knew they'd noticed. November turned into December, and Charlotte had a particularly wet winter that year. We got rain almost every other day, and the temperatures dropped into the 30s at night. I started noticing things inside my house. The air felt heavier, more humid. My windows were fogging up more than usual. I could feel dampness in the atmosphere that hadn't been there before. I bought a hygrometer and put it in the attic. Within 2 weeks, The humidity level was reading at 78%. Normal should be between 30 and 50%. I could already smell the musty odor starting to develop. I checked the insulation and found it was damp to the touch in several places. The wood rafters were starting to show signs of moisture absorption. I documented everything with photos, humidity readings, and detailed notes with timestamps. This was evidence, and I was going to need it. Right before Christmas, I was putting up lights on my house when I noticed something interesting. I wasn't the only one having moisture problems. Tom's house across the street had what looked like water stains developing under his eaves. The house 2 doors down from me had icicles forming in weird patterns that suggested ice damming. And several houses in the neighborhood had gutters that were overflowing despite not being clogged, which meant water was probably backing up under their shingles. But the most interesting development was at Brenda Patterson's house itself. She lived 4 houses down from me in a larger colonial that she'd painted an approved shade of cream. Her house was starting to show dark stains on the northern exposure wall, right where the morning condensation would be hitting. Those were moisture stains, and they were getting worse every week. I ran into Tom at the grocery store the day after Christmas. "Vince, man, I've got to talk to you. I'm having issues with my attic." "Moisture?" "Yeah, how'd you know? I went up there to store some Christmas decorations and everything felt damp. There's water beading on the roof nails. My insulation is wet in places. I called an inspector and he said my ventilation isn't adequate. But I've got the vents that were installed when the house was built." I nodded slowly. "The builder probably did the minimum required by code, maybe even less. These houses are about 12 years old, right? Building standards were different back then, and contractors cut corners all the time. My house had the same problem when I bought it. That's why I upgraded my ventilation system 3 years ago. I added more ridge vents and improved the soffit intake." Tom's face went pale. "So that's why your house was showing all that steam. You had better airflow." "Exactly. I was venting moisture properly. Everyone else's houses are trapping it inside, and it's starting to cause damage. How much is your inspector saying it'll cost to fix?" He estimated between $8,000 and $12,000. "I need more vents installed, some of my insulation replaced because it's gotten moldy, and treatment for the mold spores. This is a nightmare, Vince. My wife is furious." "I'm sorry, man. I tried to explain this to the HOA, but they wouldn't listen." Tom looked at me carefully. "You sealed your vents on purpose, didn't you? You knew this would happen." "I sealed them because the HOA ordered me to and threatened fines. I did exactly what they demanded. I've got everything documented. You knew they were wrong." "Of course I knew. I'm a mechanical engineer. I understand how air pressure, temperature, and moisture work. But they gave me a choice between complying or paying hundreds of dollars in fines and potentially losing my house to a lien. So I complied. And now they're going to learn why building codes exist." Tom ran his hand through his hair. "Jesus. This is going to hit the whole neighborhood, isn't it?" "Probably. This has been a wet winter, and moisture has nowhere to go in these poorly ventilated attics. It's just accumulating. Give it another month or 2, and people are going to start seeing real damage." I went home and checked my own attic again. The humidity was now at 81%. I could see the beginnings of mold growth on some of the rafters. My insulation was saturated in places. This was exactly what I knew would happen, and it was going to cost me money to fix, but it was worth it to prove the point. I took more photos and added them to my documentation file. In mid-January, the neighborhood Facebook group started blowing up. People were posting about moisture problems, mold growth, and ice damming. Someone posted a photo of a ceiling stain in their bedroom where water had leaked through from the attic. Another person reported that their energy bills had doubled because wet insulation doesn't work. The complaints kept coming and they all had the same theme: moisture damage in attics. Someone finally posted, "Has anyone else noticed that Brenda Patterson's house has those weird stains on the outside wall? Right on the north side. They look pretty bad." The comments on that post were interesting. People started sharing photos of various houses in the neighborhood showing moisture damage. Someone pointed out that these were all signs of ventilation problems. Another person mentioned that their home inspector had recently told them the whole subdivision had inadequate attic ventilation, and that it was a ticking time bomb that would eventually cost everyone thousands in repairs. Then someone wrote, "Didn't the HOA make that guy on Maple Street seal up his vents because they said the steam was unsightly? Wasn't that Vincent Valdez's house?" I watched the comments roll in. People were connecting the dots. Someone found the old HOA newsletter from November that had mentioned enforcement actions being taken against properties with excessive visual emissions. People started asking questions. What had the HOA been thinking? Did they not understand basic building science? Who was going to pay for all this damage? My doorbell rang on a Thursday evening in late January. I opened it to find not just Brenda Patterson, but two other HOA board members I recognized from neighborhood events: Margaret Chen, the treasurer, and Robert Dempsey, the secretary. All three of them looked significantly less confident than Brenda had back in October. "Mr. Valdez, we need to discuss the situation with your attic vents," Brenda began. "You mean the vents you ordered me to seal? What about them?" Margaret spoke up, her voice nervous. "We've been hearing about moisture problems in the neighborhood, and we wanted to ask your professional opinion as an engineer about what might be causing them." I leaned against my door frame. "You're asking me now? After you threatened to fine me for trying to explain this exact problem back in October?" Brenda's jaw tightened. "Mr. Valdez, we don't need your attitude. We're trying to help the community." "Help the community? You forced me to seal vents that were protecting my house from moisture damage. You threatened me with fines and liens when I tried to explain basic building science. And now that the exact problems I warned you about are happening all over the neighborhood, you're showing up at my door asking for help." Robert cleared his throat. "We may have been hasty in our interpretation of the bylaws. We're prepared to rescind the violation notice against your property." "That's generous of you, considering I already complied with your demands and sealed my vents." All three of them looked uncomfortable. Margaret fidgeted with her tablet. "We were hoping you might unseal them and perhaps provide guidance to other homeowners about proper ventilation. And who's going to pay for the damage that's been done to my attic? I've got mold growing on my rafters and wet insulation that needs to be replaced. That's about $4,000 in repairs, minimum. Are you personally going to cover that, or is the HOA?" Brenda's face flushed red. "The HOA can't be held responsible for homeowners' maintenance issues." "Maintenance issues? You ordered me to create this situation. I've got everything documented. Your violation notice, my response explaining the consequences, your denial, and my certified letter informing you that I was sealing the vents under protest. I've got photos showing the progressive damage over the past 3 months. I've got humidity readings. I've got expert opinions from HVAC professionals. If you think I'm eating this cost, you're out of your mind." Robert held up his hands. "Let's all calm down. Maybe we can work something out. What if the HOA agrees to cover your repair costs in exchange for your advice on how other homeowners can address their ventilation issues? $4,000 for my repairs in writing, with payment within 30 days. And I want a written apology from the HOA board, acknowledging that you were wrong about the ventilation issue and that you ignored professional advice that could have prevented neighborhood-wide damage. Brenda looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. We're not issuing any statement that implies liability for the neighborhood's problems. Then we don't have anything to talk about. You can leave my property now. Margaret touched Brenda's arm. Brenda, maybe we should consider this. The complaints are getting worse. People are talking about suing the HOA. If we can show we're taking corrective action and working with a professional to address the issue, it might limit our liability. I watched them huddle on my front porch, whispering urgently to each other. Finally, Brenda turned back to me with a strained smile. We'll discuss your proposal with the full board and get back to you within a week. You do that. In the meantime, I'm going to unseal my vents this weekend because I'm not letting my house get any more damaged. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the building inspector, who I'm sure will be very interested to hear about an HOA that ordered a homeowner to violate ventilation requirements. They left without another word. I closed the door and actually laughed. The situation was absurd, but justice felt close. That weekend was clear and cold, perfect for roof work. I spent Saturday removing all the plywood and sealant from my vents. It was satisfying work, restoring my house to proper function. By Sunday afternoon, air was flowing through my attic again. I could already feel the difference. The musty smell started to dissipate as fresh air circulated through the space, carrying moisture out. Monday morning, there was steam rising from my attic vents again. It was visible in the cold January air, white wisps of vapor that marked the escape of moisture from my house. It was beautiful in its way, this visible evidence of physics working exactly as it should. My phone rang at 9 in the morning. It was Brenda, and she sounded angry. Mr. Valdez, I just drove past your house. You've unsealed your vents without permission from the board. I don't need your permission to maintain my house properly. And like I told you Thursday night, I'm not letting my house get more damaged while you take your time making decisions. This is a direct violation of our previous ruling. Then take me to court. I'd love to explain to a judge how you ordered me to seal ventilation required by building codes. I'm sure that'll go great for you. She hung up on me. I went to work with a smile on my face. The neighborhood Facebook group continued to explode with moisture problems. Someone posted that they'd gotten a quote of $15,000 to fix their attic damage. Another person said they'd contacted a lawyer about suing the HOA for forcing inadequate building standards. The word lawsuit started appearing more and more frequently in the comments. Then someone dropped a bombshell. They'd requested documentation from the county about the original building permits for Meadowbrook Estates. According to the permits, the builder had gotten special variances that allowed for reduced ventilation requirements in exchange for using a specific type of breathable roofing material. But according to the roofing contractor who'd done some recent repairs in the neighborhood, none of the houses actually had that special roofing material. They had standard asphalt shingles. This meant the builder had gotten permits based on one design, but had built something different, leaving every house in the subdivision with inadequate ventilation. It was a code violation from day one, but nobody had caught it because the houses were relatively new and the problems took years to manifest. Suddenly, the neighborhood wasn't just angry at the HOA. They were talking about class action lawsuits against the builder. The whole situation was spiraling. I got an email from the HOA board on Wednesday. They agreed to cover my repair costs up to $5,000 and to issue a statement clarifying their position on attic ventilation. The statement didn't include an apology, but it did acknowledge that further investigation had revealed that proper ventilation was essential for preventing moisture damage, and that homeowners were encouraged to ensure their properties met current building codes. It was weak, but it was something. I accepted their offer and immediately scheduled contractors to fix my attic. The repairs took a week. They removed the moldy insulation, treated the affected wood, installed new insulation, and applied mold inhibitor to the entire space. My attic came back clean and dry, and my ventilation system was working perfectly. But the neighborhood's problems were just getting started. In February, the local news picked up the story. A reporter interviewed several homeowners about the moisture damage and the HOA's attempted enforcement of aesthetics over building codes. They interviewed me on camera, and I explained the entire situation from the beginning. The reporter looked incredulous as I showed her the original violation notice about steam from my vents. "So the HOA threatened to fine you for moisture escaping from your attic, which is exactly what's supposed to happen?" she asked. "That's correct. They called it visual pollution." I tried to explain that sealing the vents would cause moisture buildup and damage, but they wouldn't listen. They forced me to comply by threatening escalating fines and a lien on my property. And now the entire neighborhood is experiencing moisture damage. Most of it, yes. The underlying problem is that the houses were built with inadequate ventilation to begin with. My house was fine because I'd upgraded my system. But when the HOA made me seal my vents, they proved exactly what happens when you trap moisture in an attic. And they made everyone aware that this problem exists throughout the subdivision. The story aired on the evening news and went viral online. Suddenly, Meadowbrook Estates was known across Charlotte as the subdivision with the HOA that forced a homeowner to damage his house for aesthetic reasons. The comments on the news station's Facebook post were brutal. People were calling Brenda Patterson by name, criticizing her understanding of basic science, and questioning how someone so ignorant of building codes could be in charge of enforcing property standards. The HOA called an emergency meeting in late February. I attended, along with what looked like every single homeowner in the subdivision. The community center was packed. People were standing along the walls because there weren't enough chairs. The energy in the room was angry. Brenda tried to call the meeting to order, but she was immediately shouted down. People wanted answers. Who was going to pay for their repairs? Why had the HOA ignored professional advice? What were they going to do about the builder who'd apparently violated code during construction? Margaret stood up, looking nervous. "We've consulted with the HOA's attorney. Based on his advice, we're recommending that the HOA establish a fund to help offset some of the costs homeowners are incurring for moisture remediation." "Some of the costs," someone shouted. "I'm looking at $12,000 in repairs. How much is some?" "We're proposing that the HOA cover up to $2,000 per affected household, with documentation of the damage and repairs required." The room erupted. People were yelling that $2,000 wasn't nearly enough. Someone pointed out that the HOA had created this situation by raising awareness of a problem that people might not have noticed for years otherwise. If they'd just left well enough alone, homeowners could have addressed ventilation issues gradually over time instead of all at once in a panic. Robert Dempsey stood up and tried to restore order. "We understand people are upset, but the HOA's insurance doesn't cover this type of situation, and our reserve fund isn't large enough to cover everyone's full repair costs. We're doing what we can." I raised my hand and waited to be called on. Brenda looked at me like she wanted to set me on fire with her mind, but she nodded in my direction. "Vincent Valdez, Maple Street. I have a question about liability. The HOA forced me to seal my vents through threat of fines and liens. I complied under protest and documented everything. The resulting damage to my attic was directly caused by following the HOA's orders. Doesn't that create liability beyond just the general ventilation issues in the neighborhood? The HOA attorney, a tired-looking man in his 50s, leaned over and whispered something to Brenda. She looked even more unhappy. The attorney stood up. "I'm Richard Morrison, representing the HOA. Mr. Valdez is correct that his situation is distinct from the general ventilation issues. The HOA did issue an enforcement action that resulted in him sealing his vents. However, he chose to comply with that action rather than challenge it through the proper appeals process. I did challenge it. My appeal was denied. The HOA explicitly told me I had to seal the vents or face fines." Morrison checked some papers. "Yes, I see that here. Your appeal was denied in November. However, you could have continued the appeals process or sought injunctive relief from the courts, while paying $100 a day in fines. How is that a reasonable option?" The lawyer didn't have a good answer for that. He sat back down and whispered more urgently with the board members. The room was buzzing with conversation. People were putting together that the HOA had specifically ordered me to create a dangerous situation, and that this went beyond the general construction issues. Tom stood up from across the room. "I want to point out that Vincent tried to warn the HOA that this would cause damage. He sent them documentation from professionals. They ignored him and forced him to comply anyway. That's not just negligence. That's willful ignorance that harmed someone's property." Other people started chiming in. Someone pulled up my news interview on their phone and played it for the room. People watched Brenda's face get redder and redder as my explanation of the situation played on the small speaker. After about 20 minutes of chaos, Brenda called for a recess. The board and their attorney disappeared into a side room. The rest of us waited, talking in small groups. Tom came over to me. "You've got them cornered, man. They can't wiggle out of what they did to you." "Maybe. But I'm not sure what I'm expecting them to do about it. Sue them personally." Brenda and whoever else was on the board when they made that decision. They acted outside the scope of reasonable HOA authority when they ordered you to violate building codes. I'd been thinking about that. I didn't really want to sue my neighbors, even if one of them was Brenda Patterson. But I also wasn't going to let them get away with what they'd done. Sometimes you had to push back against bullies, or they'd never learn. The board came back after half an hour. Brenda looked like she'd been crying, though she was trying to hide it. Morrison stood up to speak. "The board has discussed the various issues raised tonight. Regarding the general ventilation problems in the subdivision, the HOA will be increasing the assistance fund to $3,000 per household. With the possibility of more once we've investigated potential recovery from the original builder. The HOA will also be hiring a building consultant to assess all properties and provide recommendations for proper ventilation improvements." There was some grumbling, but people seemed somewhat satisfied with that. Morrison continued. "Regarding Mr. Valdez's specific situation, the board recognizes that the enforcement action taken against his property was based on an incorrect interpretation of the covenants, and that it resulted in damage to his home. The HOA has already covered his repair costs. The board is prepared to offer an additional payment of $5,000 as compensation for the distress and inconvenience caused by this situation." I stood up. "And the public apology I requested." Morrison looked at Brenda. She stood up slowly, gripping the podium. Her voice was tight. "Mr. Valdez, The board apologizes for misapplying the HOA covenants regarding your attic ventilation. We acknowledge that we were provided with expert information explaining why the vents were necessary, and that we ignored this advice. We regret the damage this caused to your property and the stress it placed on you. We're committed to ensuring this type of overreach doesn't happen again. It wasn't the most heartfelt apology I'd ever heard, but it was public and it was on record. Everyone in the room had heard it. I nodded. I accept the apology and the settlement offer. The meeting continued for another hour, with people asking questions about the consultant, the timeline for repairs, and what would happen with the builder. The HOA agreed to investigate legal action against the construction company, though Morrison cautioned that the company might not exist anymore after 12 years. I left that meeting feeling satisfied. I'd been vindicated. The HOA had been forced to admit they were wrong. I was being compensated. And most importantly, the entire neighborhood now understood the importance of proper ventilation and would be fixing their homes correctly. But the story wasn't quite over yet. In March, the building consultant hired by the HOA released his report. It was devastating. Every single house in Meadowbrook Estates had inadequate ventilation according to current building codes. Many houses already had significant moisture damage that homeowners hadn't even noticed yet. The total cost to bring all properties up to proper standards was estimated at over $2 million across the 130 homes in the subdivision. The report also confirmed that the original builder had pulled permits for one design, but had constructed something different. The county building inspector who'd signed off on the original occupancy permits had retired years ago, but the report suggested that proper inspections hadn't been conducted. The HOA used this report to file a lawsuit against the building company. It turned out the company had been bought by a larger development firm about 5 years ago. That firm had insurance and assets. The lawsuit alleged fraud, code violations, and negligent construction. It would take years to resolve, but at least there was a potential source of recovery for homeowners. Meanwhile, the HOA board held elections in April. Brenda Patterson chose not to run for re-election. Neither did Robert Dempsey. Margaret Chen ran again and lost badly. The new board was younger, more focused on actual community building rather than rule enforcement, and much more willing to listen to homeowners who had expertise in relevant areas. One of the first things the new board did was revise the covenants. They removed vague language about visual pollution and replaced it with specific, reasonable standards. They also established an appeals committee that included homeowners with relevant professional experience who could weigh in on technical issues before enforcement actions were taken. I was asked to serve on that committee. I accepted, figuring I could help prevent other people from going through what I'd experienced. By summer, most of the houses in the neighborhood had been retrofitted with improved ventilation. You could see the difference on cold mornings. Now there were multiple houses showing steam from their vents, not just mine. It was proof that moisture was escaping properly instead of building up inside attics. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, except now people understood that those little wisps of steam represented healthy homes. Tom's repairs cost him $9,000 after the HOA's contribution. He wasn't happy about it, but he admitted his house felt better. His energy bills went down because his insulation was working properly again. He didn't have that heavy, damp feeling in his air anymore. Brenda Patterson's house required $12,000 in work. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she tried to blame the HOA for not warning homeowners about ventilation issues, which was rich considering she'd been the one preventing that information from getting out. Her house had significant rot in the roof decking that had to be replaced. Some of it was because of the original poor ventilation, but some of it was definitely because moisture had been building up over the winter when everyone's attention was focused on the problem, but nobody was fixing it yet. I ran into her at the grocery store in June. She was in the produce section, and we made eye contact across the lettuce display. For a moment, I thought she might just turn and walk away, but instead she came over to me. "Vincent," she said stiffly, "Brenda, I suppose you're feeling pretty satisfied with how everything turned out." I considered my response carefully. I'm glad my house is fixed and that the neighborhood is addressing the real problems instead of fighting about steam. I'm not glad that it cost everyone so much money or that it had to get this contentious. She looked at me for a long moment. I thought I was protecting property values. That's what the board is supposed to do. Keep the neighborhood looking nice so everyone's investment maintains value. Property values are protected by structural integrity, not by hiding evidence of problems. Those vents weren't hurting anything. They were preventing damage. If you'd listened when I tried to explain that, we could have gotten ahead of this issue before it became a crisis. I know that now. She picked up a tomato and examined it like it was the most interesting thing in the world. I was wrong. I don't admit that easily, but I was wrong, and I'm sorry. It was the first time she'd apologized to me privately, without lawyers and board members and an audience. I appreciate that. For what it's worth, I think you did care about the neighborhood. You just got focused on the wrong things. It was my husband's idea, you know. He's the one who said your vents were unsightly. He thought they were eyesores. I just ran with it because I thought that's what people wanted. She shook her head. We're probably getting divorced. This whole thing has been hell on our marriage. He blames me for the lawsuit and the repairs and the embarrassment. I didn't know what to say to that. I settled for, "I'm sorry to hear that." She shrugged. We were having problems anyway. This just brought it all to the surface. Kind of like your vents and the moisture, I guess. You can only hide problems for so long before they rot everything from the inside. That was surprisingly philosophical for Brenda Patterson. She put the tomato in her basket and walked away. I never spoke to her again. She and her husband sold their house that fall and moved out of the neighborhood. I heard they'd divorced, and she'd moved to Raleigh to be closer to her sister. The lawsuit against the development company settled in August of the following year. The HOA received $1.4 million, which worked out to about $10,000 per household after legal fees. Combined with the $3,000 the HOA had already provided, most people broke even or close to it on their repairs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. My house weathered the next winter beautifully. Steam rose from my vents on cold mornings, and I smiled every time I saw it. My attic stayed dry and healthy. My energy bills were reasonable. Everything worked the way it was supposed to. The neighborhood moved on. The new HOA board focused on organizing community events and maintaining common areas. They enforced rules about actual problems like dangerous tree limbs and broken fences. They left people alone about things that didn't matter. It was what an HOA should be. I learned a lot from the whole experience. I learned that sometimes you have to stand up to unreasonable authority even when it's difficult. I learned that documentation is crucial when you know you're right and others are wrong. I learned that physics doesn't care about your aesthetic preferences, or your bylaws, or your authority. Steam is going to condense when warm, moist air meets cold air, and moisture is going to damage your house if you trap it inside. And no amount of HOA meetings or violation notices will change those facts. I also learned that most people are reasonable when you give them good information and treat them with respect. The homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates weren't the problem. They just needed someone to help them understand what was happening with their houses. Once they had that information, they made good decisions. 3 years later, I'm still living in my house in Charlotte. The neighborhood is doing well. Property values actually went up after everyone's homes were properly repaired and ventilated. Turns out people are willing to pay more for houses that don't have hidden moisture damage and mold problems. Who knew? I still serve on the HOA's Technical Advisory Committee. We've helped several homeowners with questions about everything from drainage issues to electrical upgrades to fence placement. It feels good to use my engineering knowledge to actually help my community instead of fighting with them. And every cold morning, when I see steam rising from my attic vents, I remember that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just being right and making sure everyone learns from the experience. Sometimes it's watching physics prove your point better than you ever could with words. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA learned that building codes exist for reasons, and that you can't enforce aesthetics at the expense of structural integrity. They learned that homeowners with professional expertise should be listened to rather than threatened. They learned that admitting mistakes is better than doubling down on bad decisions. And I learned that while HOAs can be frustrating, they're made up of neighbors who are generally trying to do the right thing. They just need the right information and leadership. When Brenda Patterson was in charge, the board reflected her priorities and her blind spots. When the new board took over with different values and better processes, the HOA became something positive for the community. My story made its way around Charlotte and then around the internet. I've gotten emails from people in other states dealing with similar HOA overreach. I always tell them the same thing. Document everything, stay calm, explain the facts clearly, and don't back down when you know you're right. Sometimes you have to comply with unreasonable demands to prove a point, but make sure you're protected legally before you do. I've also been asked to speak at a couple of homeowner advocacy groups about HOA reform. I'm not an activist or anything, but I do think HOAs need better oversight and that homeowners need better tools to push back against overreach. The system shouldn't force people to choose between complying with dangerous demands or paying thousands in fines while they fight through appeals. North Carolina actually passed a law 2 years after my situation that requires HOAs to get a professional opinion before enforcing rules related to building systems or structural issues. They call it the Valdez provision informally, though that's not its official name. I'm proud of that. My stubborn fight with Brenda Patterson over steam from my vents ended up creating a small piece of protection for other homeowners. The steam still rises from my attic vents every winter morning when it's cold enough. It's a reminder that some battles are worth fighting, that physics always wins in the end, and that sometimes you have to let people make mistakes to prove why the rules exist the way they do. My house is healthy, my neighborhood is thriving, and the HOA learned to respect expertise over aesthetics. And that's the story of how the HOA threatened me over attic vent steam. I closed them up like they demanded, and their moisture problem got way worse before it got better. Justice came in the form of condensation, mold, and physics lessons that no one wanted but everyone needed. Sometimes the best teacher is natural consequences, and sometimes the most satisfying victory is being proven right by thermodynamics.